Greetings, everyone. I'm Johanna, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at SAMA. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's lecture, Monet in America and Americans in Paris. Support for tonight's program comes from our Louis A. and Francis B. Wagner Lecture Fund. For our Zoom rules, Dr. Ross King will present his lecture, and afterwards there will be time for a Q&A. So please submit your questions through the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to most, if not all, of your questions. Without further ado, I will now introduce our guest, Ross King. Dr. King is the best-selling author on Italian, French, and Canadian art and history. Among his many, many books are Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, Leonardo and the Last Supper, Mad Enchantment, Claude Monet and the Painting of the Water Lilies, among many others, including The Judgment of Paris, which can be purchased in person at the museum or online at our museum shop. Along with his writing, Dr. King serves on the Council of Academic Advisors for Friends of Florence, which is a fundraising charity that ensures the survival of Florence's art and architectural treasures. He is a regular participant in the Italian Renaissance seminars at the Aspen Institute and has given many lectures in American museums, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Frick Collection, the National Gallery, and now he's here with us at SAMA, albeit virtually. So please let us give us a silent applause to Dr. Ross King.
Thanks very much, Johanna. It's a pleasure to be here. It would be an even greater pleasure if I could be in San Antonio with you, and not least because I'd be able to see this wonderful exhibition that is running for the next 6 weeks or so. And I have actually been in San Antonio once previously, probably 2 or 3 years ago. And so it was a great disappointment to me. One of the many great disappointments all of us have had during the pandemic is lack of travel. And I was to be literally, not just virtually, in San Antonio at this time to see the exhibition and give a talk. In any case, needs must. And so what I'll do is give a talk about Monet and American Impressionism. And I'm calling it Monet in America and Americans in Paris. And I realized that it's probably a little bit of a misnomer because I'm looking specifically at Americans who went to Paris in the 1880s and 1890s in order to study art and painting, but actually found their way somewhere else, somewhere a little bit smaller and more specific. And that, of course, is Giverny, where Claude Monet reigns supreme. And so I'll look at his connections with various of these young American painters. And the other part is Monet in America. I want to look at his conquest of America at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, because I think it's all too easy for us to think that Monet was a starving artist through much of his life, when in fact he was anything but for the last, say, 4 or 5 decades of his long life. And so I want to look at the way in which he became popular first of all, really in America. Because Monet once said here, and he's speaking of Paris, he says, here above all, and only here, only in Paris, is there still a little taste. Monet believed that Paris, like many other people, that Paris was the capital of the art world, and he wanted to have his dedicated museum, what ultimately became the Orangerie, which I'll talk about very briefly at the end. He wanted to have it in Paris. He wanted his legacy to be in Paris, his greatest paintings to be in the capital of France, the capital of art. But in some ways, it's ironic that he held such a high view of the French artistic establishment because, of course, for many decades, it had rejected him. I'm sure I won't go into this too much because I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know the story of Monet turning up in Paris in the 1860s, falling in step with a group of young painters such as Edouard Manet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, and so forth, and being shunned by the artistic establishment and the critics. For anyone who doesn't know that story and wants to know more about it in a terrific read, the book Johanna mentioned, Judgment of Paris, as she said, is available for your delectation. In any case, I'll just give one example of what happened to Monet. He was rejected repeatedly in the late 1860s and early 1870s when he applied to have his work shown at the Paris salons, these annual art exhibitions, which served as showcases, window pieces for collectors, critics, and the public to come and look at hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of art. Unless you made it in the salon, you couldn't make it as an artist. And Monet, as I say, was continually rejected when he was a young man in his mid to late 20s. And a typical response is probably the most powerful man in the French art world in the 1860s was the Count de Nieuwkerk, who was the chairman of the jury in 1868, which rejected this painting by Monet. It was rejected on Nieuwkerk's demand. He said, "We've had enough of that kind of painting." And therefore, it was stamped with a red R and taken away and did not appear in the show. And of course, what happened is that in the late 60s and early 70s, enough of the work of Monet and company was rejected by French officialdom and their juries that they went out, they branched out and had their own exhibition in 1874, which was ultimately christened, thanks to this painting that Monet exhibited there that he painted 2 years earlier, which he called Impression Sunrise. They were dubbed the Impressionists. So their name really comes from one of these paintings that Monet had put in this kind of breakaway show, this secessionist show in 1874. And the rest, of course, is history. They'll hold a number of exhibitions over the next dozen years, and Monet will become, if not famous, then notorious, as would many of the other painters in the 1870s. This is a cartoon from the Charivari, which is the journal that christened them the Impressionists, thanks to its article, its sort of comic article making fun of Monet's paintings. And this is a scene that we're led to believe one might encounter if you went to this is the third Impressionist exhibition in 1877. Come back to it in a minute. You might see a gendarme hastily steering a pregnant woman away from the display of their paintings, telling her it's not advisable to enter, protecting her from the shock that may cause her to go into labor prematurely or even harm her unborn child. And certainly, I mean, this is an exaggeration, but certainly the newspaper reports of the day are full of sort of puce-faced men shaking their walking sticks at these offensive paintings. But I can happily report Monet came through this. He came through the, for him, rather horrific decade of the 1870s, when a recession in France made it so that it was difficult for him and his friends to sell much art, especially rowing as they were against the current of public and critical opinion. But by the time the story that I'm going to be concentrating on begins, Monet is, well, he's not quite a dangerous radical. He was known as the paysan de Vernon, the peasant of Vernon, this town in France near Giverny. And here he is photographed by Theodore Robinson, who I'll come to in a couple of minutes, his neighbor in Giverny, photographed standing in his garden. And so he's hardly a dangerous influence at this point. And in fact, he becomes a very positive influence, a very powerful influence, certainly on these young painters such as Robinson, who begin coming to Giverny, both to paint the effects of the village and the countryside itself, the optical effects of it, which many of them believed, like Monet, were unique. And also, if they were lucky, to have a kind of intimate discourse with the master himself, i.e. Monet, who becomes, by the end of the 19th century, the heavyweight champion of painting in France. So I just want to emphasize that Monet, by the 1880s and 1890s, when these Americans are flocking to Paris to see him and to imitate his style, Monet is, even though he's middle-aged at this point, he's really the grand old man of French art. He's the head of the French school, and he's been declared by a lot of French magazines and newspapers as one of the greatest painters who has ever lived. So his reputation is truly colossal. And that's one of the things that acts as this powerful magnet that draws them down the Seine, downstream in the Seine from Paris to Giverny. And he really does become a celebrity in America by 1900, as well as in France. This is a 1901 article from the New York Tribune. It's a fairly long piece. It actually continues in the lower half of the page. And here is Monet's bewhiskered face peering at us from out from under the masthead. And he's called the Impressionist master in this. And this journalist actually refers to the Impressionists as the Monet school. And by that, he's not just referring to Impressionists such as Renoir and company, he's referring to the American painters now as well. So in some ways, they're all part of this large school at whose head there is Claude Monet. And the Los Angeles Herald anointed him as the most honored and most talked of among the followers of the Impressionist school. And by the 1890s, Monet was by far renowned, far more renowned than any of his compatriots, any of his peers, whether it's Camille Pissarro, Degas, Renoir, even Manet, who of course was dead by 1883. He is head and shoulders above all of them in terms of his reputation. And in fact, his reputation and his popularity in America become such that by the mid-1890s, a woman supposedly exclaims at an exhibition of his work, Monet is so great that all painters ought to paint Monets. That what you must do is imitate Monet if you're going to do beautiful works of art. And in fact, by the time she said this in the mid-1890s, it seemed that a lot of young American painters were doing just that. They were channeling Monet because they had sort of absorbed through a kind of osmosis Monet's way of painting, his way of seeing the world, the way of structuring his canvases, and the way of using his pigments and these flickering touches of color that we see so brilliantly, so coruscatingly depicted in Young Woman in the Garden at Giverny from 1888. Just a couple of examples of painters who fell under his spell. One of them is a painter whose work you'll see in the exhibition at the museum, and that's J. Alden Weir, who went to France in the 1470s to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, and he studied with one of the most renowned painters in France, but one of the most conservative, a man named Gérôme, who hated the Impressionists. He was really, in many ways, their arch enemy and did everything he could to suppress their careers. And in fact, in 1903, as late as 1903, Gérôme was still denouncing them as humbug and saying they were terrible painters, when most of the rest of the world had begun to embrace them or had realized their genius. In any case, Weir, as a young man in his early 20s in Paris, goes to study under Gérôme, which is at the École des Beaux-Arts, the top French art school. And he begins painting in a style that really channels Gérôme, who did Orientalist paintings. He did a lot of paintings, very realistic, beautifully rendered paintings of scenes from life under the canvas in North Africa, etc. Lots of camels, lots of people wearing turbans, snake charmers, that sort of thing. And Weir, despite the fact that he comes from West Point, New York, begins doing this kind of painting. And in 1877, Weir goes to the third Impressionist exhibition, the one in which we saw the gendarme steering the pregnant woman away from the paintings. And Weir's response to these paintings, the Impressionists, were much like the gendarmes. He wrote home to his parents and he said, "I never in my life saw more horrible things. It was worse than the Chamber of Horrors." So that's Weir as a conservative young painter at the age of 25 in Paris. But he ultimately he travels around Europe and he sees crucially, he sees an Impressionist exhibition in the 1880s, and everything changes. And which was pointed out by the New York Sun in 1891, when the critic said his work has wholly changed. It's the influence of the Impressionistic school that one traces. And to say that is to say, of course, the influence of Claude Monet. And you could see the way in which Weir begins dissolving forms. He gets rid of those solid forms that he learned from Gérôme and begins dissolving forms into color and light and working with much, much brighter colors and much looser brushstrokes. So he really becomes a full paid up member of the Impressionist community. Someone else, Edmund Tarbell from Boston, who went to, likewise, I mean, his profile fits exactly that of all of the painters, virtually all of the painters that I'm going to be talking about. He goes to Paris as a young man in the 1880s and initially to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, or to study at one of the ateliers in Paris, but ultimately falls under the spell unofficially of Impressionism. It's almost as if there was this, they had their curriculum, which was in drawing plaster casts and things like that in the official studios. But then there was the extracurricular activity, which really bewitched them. And they would gather together in small groups and they would push off and go to places such as Giverny or Fontainebleau and begin painting in the course of the summer. And so the Boston Post, his home newspaper, pointed out that he was profoundly impressed and greatly helped by the work of Claude Monet. And one of the ones who channeled him most beautifully, I think we could say, is Childe Hassam, also from Boston. And almost to his dying days, Hassam cleaved to this style of Monet's that he saw for the first time in the 1880s. This is the painting that I showed you, that I had on the title card, which is now incidentally in the Oval Office. I think it's on at least its third administration in the Oval Office. And why not? It's an absolutely beautiful painting. But it does owe debts to Monet, as does so much of Hassam's work. American Art News noted as late as 1918 that Hassam, who was a very mature painter by that point in his 50s, that he was still a disciple of Claude Monet. And in fact, he may have unconsciously been putting his mind back to the flag paintings that Monet had done in 1878 as he did his work. So that's a kind of taster of what happened to these painters who arrived in Paris with, perhaps good intentions to become conservative academic painters, but were bewitched by the life of Paris, by the life of the French countryside, and ultimately by the paintings of the Impressionists in general, and Monet in particular. And so it was Monet then that brought them to the little village, population 300 of Giverny, which is found some 50 miles northwest of Paris, downstream on the Seine. And they began descending initially in the 1880s, very soon after Monet had appeared there. And of course, they would continue really throughout his lifetime to come. There was an American colony at Giverny. And if any of you have been there, and I'm sure many of you have been, and if you haven't, you must go, you'll know that there is what was known as the Museum of American Impressionism in Giverny, the Terra Foundation for American Art, which had a wonderful collection. And it's now the Museum of Impressionisms, plural, and has wonderful exhibitions on Impressionist paintings, the Impressionist style of painting from around the world. In any case, the pioneers, the first guys to come, were people who either knew Monet, like John Singer Sargent, who knew of him before he arrived in 1885. I think by 1885, Sargent had not yet set foot in the United States, although he might have gone in the 1870s, possibly when he was in his 20s. So I could be corrected on that. In any case, he's very much an expatriate, cosmopolitan figure, born in Florence, lived, spoke 3 or 4 languages, and ultimately would go and live in England. But he was a good friend of Monet's, and they kept in touch for many decades. And he went in the summer of 1885 really to visit Monet and to see what the life of the country was like there. But 2 other painters also came that year. They knew one another. They seem to have come independently, but certainly the draw was Monet, who had moved there 2 years earlier in 1883. And that's, of course, Theodore Robinson, who took that photograph from about 1888 that I showed you, and Willard Metcalf. Both of them, as I say, got to know Monet very well. Theodore Robinson literally became his neighbor and lived next door to him for the better part of a decade. And Willard Metcalf got to know him well enough that Monet let him paint his garden. And this work is in the exhibition, and it's remarkable, besides being a very beautiful painting, it's a remarkable historical document because this is the first recorded view of Monet's garden. Monet in 1885, 2 years after moving into his house, had not yet begun to paint it. He had not yet begun to paint his garden, and yet Willard Metcalf had did so, and so it gives us a view of what it was when it was still very much in its embryonic state in terms of Monet's design for it. But within a couple of years of that, in 1887, word got back to the United States that there was now a kind of new American art colony in Giverny, and Art Amateur, a magazine that was really dedicated to what it describes as art amateurs, painters, illustrators, and so forth, talks about the American colony that's gathered in Giverny, he misspells it, 70 miles from Paris on the Seine. And then he name checks people: Louis Ritter, Willard Metcalf, Theodore Wendell, John Leslie Breck, who I'll come to in a minute, and Theodore Robinson. A few pictures just received from the young men show that they've all got the blue-green color of Monet's Impressionism and got it bad. And so what they realize, what the critics back home in America realize, is that these young guys are channeling Monet's style of painting. They're in Giverny not just for what one of them called, what one of the painters who went there called the flood of iridescent hues, this beautiful microclimate that Giverny and that bit of the Seine Valley appears to have, but they went in order to sort of sit at the feet of the master and learn his style. And in fact, someone like Theodore Robinson became close enough to Monet that Monet would actually have Robinson critique his pictures, or ask him at least what he thought of them. But knowing Monet, the best thing to do was nod enthusiastically and tell him that he had done it right on the button, or else he would never get to speak to him again, probably. And so here they are. They're now beginning to descend. This is really the first wave of these painters who are coming. One of the more interesting ones is John Leslie Breck, who does a painting here. I mean, and this shows how intimate he got with Monet. He does a painting of one of Monet's, in fact, I'll show you another one. He has done two of Monet's stepdaughters. Monet's first wife died in 1879, 4 years before he moved to Giverny. And so a few years after that, in 1892, he married Alice Oshday, who had 6 children of her own. He had 2 boys that became a blended family. So he had these young stepdaughters in Giverny. And John Leslie Breck began courting one of them, and much to Monet's displeasure, who said, "A painter of all things." Because Monet, a painter, was not good enough for one of Monet's stepdaughters. He fancied something more for her. Incidentally, this is at the Mint Museum in North Carolina, in Charlotte, and the Mint coming up, I think, in the autumn, and then traveling to the Fig in Davenport and the Dixon in Memphis is having a John Leslie Breck exhibition. And I think it's long overdue. He's a very interesting painter, not just because of his connections with Monet, as you can see, sadly short-lived. Not murdered by Monet, incidentally, who might have entertained plans of it when he learned about Breck's interest in his stepdaughters. Here he is painting another one. This is Blanche Oshday, the one he actually began courting. And Monet put the frighteners on him, and Breck left. Poor Breck fled Giverny, never to return. But once again, we can see the intimacy that he had with the master. He is in the garden. This is Monet's house, which I'm sure you'll recognize, the famous pink. And we can see the flowers here. Blanche, the stepdaughter, who was a painter in her own right. Blanche is painting, and Monet is in the background wearing his hat, and he has his own easel that he's busy at work on. And so Breck had this intimate connection with the family for a year or two at least. He also possibly painted with Monet. He may have sat side by side with him in the autumn of 1890 and the spring of 1891, when Monet was doing his famous grain stack series of paintings, 25 paintings of grain stacks or haystacks, because Breck did his own. He did a series of exactly what Monet was doing. I think he did 15, so a couple fewer than Monet, but nevertheless, he had exactly the same idea, no doubt imbibed from Monet, of painting these grain stacks under varying conditions of light, shade, weather conditions, and so forth. So he really is becoming a little Monet, almost. We can see him following Monet around the fields. Monet would have his stepdaughters bring his easels to him in a wheelbarrow, and he would paint works such as this one, which just recently sold. Well, 2 years ago, it sold for over 100 million, and worth every penny, I would say, as well. And so we can see that Breck is very much influenced by Monet, and as I say, quite possibly working with him. And these things that become synonymous with Monet, because his grain stack paintings were one of his first enormous successes when he showed them in a solo exhibition. He showed his 25 grain stacks, where they're shown in these conditions of light and shade and times of the day and weather conditions, etc. A huge success, and it becomes synonymous really with him. And then other people begin using that motif in their own work, including another American painter who turned up in Giverny in the early 1890s, Theodore Earl Butler, who does a painting keyed to the same high color as Monet's work, and even in some ways repeating the pattern of it. Butler came to know Monet extremely well, and in fact lived in Giverny for decades, and lo and behold, successfully courted one of Monet's stepdaughters, Suzanne, the woman you saw in that first painting by Breck. Maybe even more impressively, he managed to convince Monet to give her his hand, give her her hand in marriage. And so here we see him proudly walking through Giverny with his new bride in the wedding march, done, of course, by Theodore Robinson, his close friend and Monet's close friend, for the wedding in 1892. So there's this close connection, it appears, between Monet and a number of painters who arrive in Giverny in the mid to late 1880s. But there's a great irony here because of the fact that Monet was decidedly not a teacher. He did not want to be, and he claimed that he had nothing to teach anyone. He said there's no recipe for painting, positively none. And I think he wasn't just trying to dodge any kind of responsibility for teaching the next generation of painters or anything like that. I think he was an intuitive painter. And I think he didn't overthink things. He had no theory about how you painted. He just went out and did it. He was a natural, and therefore he was not really someone who could tell someone else how to paint. And when he was asked in an interview in the 1890s if he taught people, he said, "What could I teach? To do what I'm doing, then you'd become a little Monet, perhaps, a bad Monet, surely," which once again shows his sense of his own self-importance, that no one of his students could ever have accomplished what he has done, which no doubt was true. But I think, this reminds me of the story of George Gershwin wanting to meet Maurice Ravel and have Ravel give him lessons in composition. And Ravel told him, why be a second-rate Ravel when you can be a first-rate Gershwin? And I think in as much as Monet gave any kind of lessons to these young painters, that's what he did. Maybe told them just to be themselves, and possibly he sucked his teeth and rolled his eyes and smashed his forehead when he saw how they were channeling his work so closely and becoming these little Monets that were spawning on the banks of the Seine outside Giverny. Other ones, though, still did get discourse with him. One of the ones that you'll see in the exhibition is Guy Rose, I think one of the most interesting of the California painters, a great American Impressionist who came to Giverny in, well, this is him in 1890. He's sitting possibly in Monet's garden. He was a shy character, and he would sort of pursue Monet from a distance and try to watch him paint. He didn't want to get too close to Monet. He would sort of snarl like a dog when it was eating as he painted. So, and as the French press said, Monet had developed a reputation for savagery to get rid of some of these importunate Americans who would come up to him and want advice, and who would sometimes ask him for souvenirs, such as one of his brushes. And he was very alarmed by this, and in fact in 1892 even threatened to leave Giverny, to leave his beloved home and garden there, in order to escape the attentions of these people. But nevertheless, despite this kind of carapace of gruffness that he used to protect himself from the interests and attentions of visitors to Giverny, and not just Americans, because there were other nationalities who came as well. But despite this carapace, he did open up little bits to people such as Guy Rose, who was able to discourse with him. And as I think this, the Los Angeles Herald says this, that he was as nearly a pupil to the great artist as any student may hope to be. Which may well be true, but probably the one who had the closest relationship with him was Lilla Cabot Perry, who came from a very venerable, almost aristocratic Boston family. Her husband, who was a Harvard professor, was I think the grandson of Commodore Matthew Perry, who opened up Japan to international trade. And of course, she was one of the Cabots from Boston. And Monet was quite taken with her, whether, I think part of it was her painting, because she was an extremely good painter. But I think he also liked her social connections and being so always having an eye on his own self-interest. Monet perhaps was realized that Lilla Cabot Perry could do a lot for him in the United States, as indeed she did for him and a lot of other painters. But when he died in 1926, she gave her reminiscences of him, because she and her husband spent about a decade. They would come each summer to Giverny, and she would paint there. And she got to know Monet very well, and he would give her pointers. And she was the beneficiary of the only piece of advice that we know that Monet ever gave to any other painter. He was usually extremely mum about what the secret of good painting was. But what Lilla says is that he told her once, when you go out to paint, try to forget what objects you have before you. Paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape, until it gives your own naive impression of the scene before you. And I think this is probably a very accurate representation of Monet's technique. And in fact, when Vasily Kandinsky saw one of Monet's haystack paintings coming from Moscow, he'd never seen a grain stack, so he didn't know what it was. He was intrigued by it. He thought it was some sort of an abstraction because of the fact that he couldn't imagine what Monet was painting. Monet had drifted off the moorings of realism far enough into the sort of realms of color and form, almost abstract form, that Kandinsky was inspired to go on and create, by 1913, his own abstract works of art. And so this idea of forgetting what an object is and just painting it as the object is with this naive or innocent eye that painters really since then have really been interested in capturing. This is what Picasso is trying to do when he talks about having to, that he wishes he was born blind and suddenly was, as an adult, was able to see, because he could see all these objects but not attach names to them and not come to them with any preconceptions of what they were. So in any case, pre-Picasso, this is what Monet is telling to Lilla Cabot Perry. Now, the next thing I'm going to look at is Monet arriving in America. And sadly, he never came to America. He wasn't a great traveler. He went to London a couple of times. He went to the south of France and northern Italy. He just dipped his toe across the French border, the Italian border, into the Italian Riviera. He never came to America despite his popularity there, but he arrived in the 1880s. And in fact, he arrived most emphatically in 1886 when, or his works rather, I'm talking about, of course, when the year that the Statue of Liberty was unveiled in the city. And so you get these two great French imports, the Statue of Liberty and the Impressionists are really arriving in America at the same time. This was an interesting time to arrive, the 1880s and 1890s, because this is, of course, the Gilded Age, where you have tycoons such as J.P. Morgan, who are buying up everything that they can in Europe. They're buying coffered ceilings from 17th century Italian palazzos. They're buying frescoes. They're buying altarpieces. They're buying, if we're to believe this cartoon in Puck magazine, they're buying papal mitres and things like that. They're buying everything that they can from antique dealers like Stefano Bardini, who had this enormous warehouse in Florence. Bardini would sell antiquities to people like Stanford White, who would then use it to furnish the Fifth Avenue mansions of his many clients. But of course, there was a danger to this. If you're JP Morgan, maybe you can afford to have people to scrutinize everything that you buy to make sure it's not a fake. But a lot of Americans got their hands burned as greedy dealers realized there were naive but wealthy Americans arriving on their shores at their doors looking for great works of art, looking for old masters, looking for bishops' croziers and things such as that to take back and adorn their palaces at Newport, Rhode Island, etc. But enough of them got burned then that they decided that what they had to do was to, turn to a different kind of painting, that of live painters, where they could exert a kind of quality control, not least from the artist, him, or sometimes herself. And even before this great sort of boom in European antiquities, the crayon in 1855 said, gave advice to what it called Mr. Croesus, in other words, the very wealthy magnate or plutocrat, telling him always prefer a modern to an old picture because you can't be duped, or it's much more difficult to be duped by a modern picture. And therefore, that led to the popularity in the 1860s and 70s of the painters of the French modern school, the Barbizon. And this is a typical example of it by possibly the greatest and certainly the most successful practitioner, Jean-Francois Millet. 2/3 of all Millet's paintings went to the United States. He was the clog-wearing son of a shepherd. He was known as the painter of dunghills by his critics because of the fact that he painted these scenes of rural poverty, which sort of counterintuitively appealed to the captains of industry in America in the post-bellum period. I think maybe they wanted reassurance that the workers that they employed, or the true worker was not the person flying the red rag of revolution and trying to unionize the workers, but rather the kind of noble, honest peasants who were toiling hard in the field, such as given to them by Jean-Francois Millet. One of the other very, very famous practitioners, very popular in America, likewise, was Camille Corot. But by the 1880s, there was a problem with the Barbizon paintings, and that was they were so popular in America that they were being forged wholesale in places like Belgium, especially the works of Corot. There's an expression that developed in the 20th century by someone who said that Camille Corot painted 600 paintings, of which 6,000 were in the United States. So there were all sorts of fake Corots floating around. So again, there's danger now. If you're an art collector, you can get your hands burned again. So what is the remedy for this? And a man turned up in America in the 1880s with the solution to the problem. He was someone who began his career as an art dealer selling Jean-Francois Millet, Theodore Rousseau, all of these great Barbizon painters. But now by the 1880s, he had converted himself to the Impressionists. He became the great dealer, really the dealer of the Impressionist painters. And in New York in the late 1880s, he began giving interviews assuring the readers of the papers that our new painters, the new French painters, are the direct successors of Delacroix, Corot, Daubigny, and produced veritable masterpieces. So he's saying, do you remember Camille Corot, that no one would buy his work in France, and now his work is worth vast sums of money here in America? Well, there's the next generation coming along now. These guys, you don't know their names yet: Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Henri Fantin-Latour, etc. These are the next ones. And so he really begins showing their work, trying to create a market for them. And that really is what he was doing. He was a salesman, and he was selling the Impressionists to America with the help of James F. Sutton of the American Art Association. And Durand-Ruel, first of all, brought the Impressionists to America. The first time they appeared there was in 1883 at the Foreign Exhibition of Arts, Manufactures, and Products. In other words, at a trade fair in what doubled in winter as a hockey rink. And so some of Monet's works, 3 of his works, went on display there, along with various French fancies such as cigarette holders and bonbons and a rotary cannon and things like that that had been invented or were sold in France. And so these French paintings were commodities like anything else produced in France, and none of them sold. And Monet in particular was slated by a couple of critics, who, one of whom said that this work, which is now in the National Gallery, he said it is the work of a myopic amateur and has no value of any sort. And so none of the work sold, and Durand-Ruel retreated back to France before waiting a couple of years and then making a return voyage with French paintings in 1886, which he put on display with Sutton's help at the National Academy of Design. And this time, the Impressionists, and more particularly Monet, swept the board. Monet was the most prolifically represented painter in the show. There were 289 canvases on show, of which Monet had 40, and 37 of those sold before the show closed. So Monet really made a splash at this point in 1886. Both of these works, incidentally, were in that exhibition, as was this one now in Denver. And he was represented in the press, both in the clippings coming from France and in the reviews then written of the exhibition in New York. He was depicted as the leader of the school and the greatest of the Impressionist painters. He was the most brilliant painter of the school. He leads the school. One of the reviews said, whatever is tender, exquisite, etc., subtle and landscape art is found in his works. And so one of the questions is, what was it about Monet's work that appealed to Americans, and why was he more popular than, say, Degas or Edouard Manet, his near namesake? And I think that reason is singled out by a magazine called The Art Age, which gave a review of it in April 1886. And it deplored what it called the complex problems of human life depicted by Manet and Degas, and to a lesser extent, Renoir. And some of these painters who showed outcasts and misfits and people on the margins of society, dancers, prostitutes, people drinking absinthe, or in the case of Monet, Olympia. This painting was not brought to America, I should say, in 1886. I think that certainly would have frightened the livestock. And so Durand-Ruel decided he would not bring something like that. The absinthe drinker, again, an image of someone, an alcoholic perhaps. This is a rag trader, someone on the margins of society. And this was potentially disturbing. It had social overtones and perhaps revolutionary overtones. Certainly, a lot of French critics regarded some of the Impressionists as revolutionaries, not just in art, but in politics as well. And Camille Pissarro, in credit to the instincts of these French critics, Pissarro was an anarchist and had very left-wing opinions. Manet probably as well, despite the fact that he came from a very bourgeois family. Monet had very left-wing opinions. And his art probably spoke much more eloquently than he did verbally about any issues about the place of people on the margins of society. Monet did not do that kind of thing in his art. And the art age, after sort of recoiling from these social outcasts, talked about how Monet's paintings are full of a heavenly calm and how Monet comes before us like a messenger of peace. And really, this is the sort of thing that the American Impressionists would seize upon and cleave to. The kind of beauty of the countryside, of sun-dappled light, of women under parasols, giving the visions not of outcasts from society, but rather of members of society, members of a society that have done well in a society which presumably, therefore, is doing well in and of itself. And their paintings, I suppose, reflect an image of America at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, as a more self-confident and prosperous place in which problems of urbanization, immigration, poverty, all of these things, which are addressed in by other artists, such as the Ashcan School, most notably, have no place. The American Impressionists, for the most part, painted rural scenes, village scenes, both in France and when they returned to America, and for the most part did not paint scenes of urban life. Or if they did, Childe Hassam is the great exception to that, they really made it picturesque and visually exciting. And the New York City that Childe Hassam paints is a New York City that we would all love to walk into because it looks so alluring and attractive. And so that's what these painters, here's Theodore Wendel's Butterfly Catchers, a very innocent image of summertime, of childhood, of a country at peace with itself. And so it's this vision, a kind of vision of people belonging in their landscape and enjoying their landscape recreationally. That was the great gift that American Impressionism had to America and that Monet had to the Impressionists. And just to sum up then, I want to look briefly at Monet, at the investments in Monet and at his prices, and why you would try to imitate his art if you were a young painter trying to make your way in the world. Because the Boston Evening Transcript, as early as 1892, seems to be the first one to use the two homonyms together and say Monet spells money, and sort of show me the Monet kind of pun. Monet was known for having high prices even in the late 19th century. And in 1886, so just after this Impressionist exhibition in New York, the Forum said that poppies in a wheat field aren't worth a cent, but poppies in an impression picture may come to very many dollars if a boom of enthusiasm can be started. And that boom did begin. And for Monet, it really began in 1886 when I said 37 of his 40 paintings sold. And they went to very wealthy individuals, such as Abel Kingman, who worked for the Alexander T. Stewart Corporation, Irwin Davis, a New Yorker who had mines in the West, or Albert Spencer, who was a very wealthy gambler who owned the clubhouse in Saratoga Springs, and who all of them bought multiple Monet paintings to adorn their houses. And they appreciated the art, but they were also, in many cases, commodities dealers who could recognize the value of something that was going to go up almost as much as shares in a silver mine. And so I just, to give one example, this painting by Monet was sold in 1887, so just after its introduction in America, for $975 US, which was a lot of money. The average wage of the American worker in the 1880s was 1,000. So it would take a year's wages of the average American worker to purchase a Monet painting. But 8 years later, it sold for $1,800 to Theodore Davis. So it realized an 85% increase over the course of those 8 years. And Davis put it in his house in Newport, Rhode Island, and in fact, homes all across America, whether on Fifth Avenue in New York, where Louisine Havemeyer purchased 30 Monets, or on the Gold Coast of Chicago, where Bertha Palmer, Mrs. Potter Palmer, bought 90 Monets to adorn her parapeted, turreted mansion on the Gold Coast on Lake Michigan, where her Impressionist paintings and her Monets in particular sat with the very expensive china among marble pillars and tiger skin rugs and things like that. And so these became luxury items that you could not consider yourself a proper plutocrat in the 1890s, first decade of the 20th century, unless you had a brace of Monets in your possession. And of course, just to conclude, this is allowing Monet to live in the style to which, let's face it, all of us would love to be accustomed. And it allows him to have his house and his garden in Giverny, to have his beautiful cars, his collection of cars. He had 32,000 francs worth of cars at a time when the average wage in Paris was 1,000 francs. And crucially, it allowed him to make his water lily pond, which then allowed him to paint his water lily paintings between 1914 and his death in 1926. Now in the Musée de l'Orangerie, and Joanna mentioned a certain book on the subject called Mad Enchantment, if you want to know about those years in the life of Monet. So I'll end with that, but I hope you have some questions for me, and I hope if you haven't done so, you're able to go and see America's Impressionism, because I think one of the last things, or one of the things that we've learned over the past year is how much art and beauty means to us as we've been in lockdown and things like that. And so I think art gives you the beauty and the sheer exaltation of beauty that you get from Impressionism in general. And I think in particular from a lot of the paintings in this exhibition. So it'll be a real treat. And as I said at the beginning, it grieves me that I'm not going to be able to be there to enjoy it for myself. So go and see it vicariously for me.